Welcome to this deep dive. Looks like we're diving into some Noam Chomsky today with Year 501, The Conquest Continues.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to hear what you found most fascinating and thought-provoking
Well,
in these excerpts.
Chomsky really digs into history and power and ideology.
Right, and how it all connects to, our lives today.
Exactly. He challenges a lot of the common narratives about empires.
So where do we even begin with this?
Where should we start?
Well, he starts with the origins of British foreign investment.
Okay.
And I found it really interesting how he connects that to people like Sir Francis Drake,
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
pirate in one era and a celebrated hero in another.
Right. It's fascinating how our perspective on these figures can change so much over time.
Like, is it the person or is it the system that enables them?
Exactly. And that's where the British East India Company comes in.
Oh, yeah, they had a monopoly over trade with the East, right?
Yeah, granted by the British Crown.
But it wasn't just about commerce.
No, it was about power and control.
And let's be honest, often brutal extraction of resources.
Exactly.
Like the word loot. That actually comes from Hindi.
Wow.
It entered the English language during this period.
That's a powerful symbol of the kind of violence and exploitation that
Yeah.
went along with these empires.
Right. It wasn't just...
And it's not just ancient history either.
Right, like it's still happening today.
Chomsky traces this theme throughout history.
Okay.
He connects those early colonial ventures to the practices of modern corporations and global institutions.
So it's like the past isn't really past.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's talk about Adam Smith then.
Okay.
Because he's often considered...
The father of modern economics.
Yeah, and like free markets.
Correct.
I mean, everyone talks about free market.
All the time.
But Chomsky suggests that modern interpretations
Yeah.
kind of ignore Smith's warnings about exploitation.
Especially in the context of colonialism.
Yeah.
Like, if you actually read Smith's work, he was very aware of the dangers of unchecked greed.
Right.
He knew the powerful could exploit the weak.
Oh, totally.
He was especially critical of how the colonies were treated.
So we've kind of cherry-picked the parts of his theories that we like and ignored the inconvenient truths.
Right.
Okay, well, this leads us to another point that Chomsky makes.
Okay.
It's about the dehumanizing language used to justify conquest.
Oh, yeah, like when he talks about Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt using terms like savage beasts to describe indigenous populations.
It's chilling.
It's really disturbing.
Like this language.
It wasn't just words.
Yeah.
It was about creating a narrative to legitimize the displacement and extermination of entire groups of people.
Wow. And it's not just something from the past, is it?
No, unfortunately not.
Even the idea of American exceptionalism.
Right. The idea that the U.S. expands by its own merits without force.
It ignores the historical realities.
Exactly. Chomsky calls it the narrative of benevolent expansion. It's like a more palatable way to describe something really awful.
Exactly.
But it's a myth.
Right.
So how do we break free from these myths?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think Chomsky would say it starts with being critical.
Okay.
And questioning the stories we're told.
So it's about looking beyond the surface.
Exactly. And recognizing the patterns of power and ideology that shape our world.
To be more informed and engaged?
Right, to not just accept things at face value.
Okay, well, let's move into the 20th century then.
Okay.
Specifically the Cold War.
Which Chomsky describes as a global chessboard.
I like that imagery.
Yeah.
He argues that the U.S. was trying to maintain its dominance by preventing any independent development in Asia.
And suppressing neutralism.
So it wasn't just about ideology.
No, it was also about power and control.
Okay, but how did this actually play out?
Well, Chomsky gives specific examples.
I see.
Like the U.S. opposition to economic nationalism in Indonesia. It was seen as a challenge to Western interests. So who gets to call the shots on a global scale?
That's the fundamental question.
And it seems like the tactics might have changed.
Yeah.
But those dynamics of power are still at play.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, speaking of change, Chomsky says that the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't lead to a more democratic world.
Which many people hoped for.
Right. Instead, he calls it the rise of a new imperial age.
He describes it as a system of indirect rule with institutions like the G7, the IMF, and the World Bank.
So the players changed, but the game stayed the same.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, well, this leads us to another point he makes.
Right.
The hypocrisy of free market ideology.
Right, like it's only free for some.
Yeah, and he uses examples like Bolivia
Where IMF-imposed austerity measures led to increased poverty.
Yeah, it's free markets for some, but not for all.
Exactly.
And it's not just economics.
No.
Chomsky is also critical of how human rights rhetoric is used selectively.
Like when it serves U.S. interests?
Yeah. Right, and then ignored in cases like the Indonesian massacre of 1965.
It's a double standard.
It makes you question the real motivations behind some of these interventions.
Well, Chomsky sees the case of Cuba as a litmus test for U.S. policy.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
He says that even after the Cold War ended, U.S. hostility towards Cuba didn't go away.
It actually intensified.
Yeah, now framed under democracy and human rights.
It's like the justification changed.
Right.
But the outcome remained the same.
Exactly.
It really makes you think
about
the true reasons behind foreign policy decisions.
Chomsky forces us to question the narratives we're given and to really dig into the complexities of global power dynamics.
Okay, well, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
It is.
We've got a lot more to unpack.
So
stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive.
It's going to be good.
Into Noam Chomsky's Year 501.
I can't wait. So we were talking about how Chomsky challenges those narratives.
Like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Right. Yeah, each layer you peel back reveals a whole new complexity.
Exactly. And speaking of shifting perspectives,
okay,
I think his analysis of the MIA issue is a great example.
Oh, yeah.
Of how he kind of deconstructs those carefully crafted narratives.
It's so powerful on the surface. It just seems like a straightforward issue.
Like, let's find these missing soldiers.
Right, but Chomsky argues that it goes much deeper than that.
He sees it as a way to perpetuate this narrative of American victimhood in Vietnam.
Exactly.
I mean, the disparity between the focus on American MIAs and the silence about the millions of Vietnamese who were killed or displaced during the war.
It's like whose stories get told and whose suffering gets acknowledged.
He uses the terms worthy and unworthy victims.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
It really is.
It's like, by portraying itself as the victim, the U.S. avoids acknowledging its own responsibility.
For the destruction it caused.
Exactly.
So it can maintain its image as this force for good.
Even when its actions suggest otherwise.
And he contrasts the demand for remorse from Japan for Pearl Harbor with the lack of remorse demanded from the U.S. for its actions in Vietnam.
That comparison really highlights the double standard.
It really does.
When it comes to accountability.
Like, who gets to set the rules?
Right. Who gets to decide what's just?
It feels like we're back to those themes of power and control.
Oh, absolutely. Power isn't just about brute force.
Right.
It's about shaping narratives and controlling information.
Like history becomes a battleground.
It is a battleground.
Of controlling the present.
To shape the future.
So Chomsky's urging us to be aware of these manipulations.
To be skeptical, to seek out different perspectives.
To be critical consumers of information, to challenge those dominant narratives.
Exactly. To recognize that history is not neutral.
It's a story.
It's a story that's constantly being constructed.
And reconstructed.
Right. And that story has real-world implications.
It shapes how we understand everything.
Everything.
So much is at stake.
Absolutely. Chomsky believes a more just and equitable world is possible.
Okay.
But only if we confront these realities of power.
Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, it starts with questioning.
Questioning everything.
Being skeptical, seeking out diverse perspectives.
Like digging deeper.
Digging deeper, yeah. Chomsky's work gives us the tools to do that.
I see. It's about becoming more informed.
More engaged. Yeah. Not just accepting things at face value.
So let's bring this back to you, the listener.
Okay.
What do you think about this idea of history as a battleground?
Have you ever noticed how certain historical narratives are prioritized?
It's a fascinating question to think about.
It is.
And it's particularly relevant when we consider how Chomsky tackles the U.S.'s role as a champion of freedom and democracy.
This image that's so deeply ingrained in our culture.
Exactly. But Chomsky argues that these ideals are often used as a smokescreen.
Right, to mask the true motivations of U.S. foreign policy.
Which we've seen.
Often rooted in self-interest and power.
So it's like saying one thing and doing another.
Right.
It makes you question those motivations.
It really does.
He points to the Cold War as a prime example.
Where the U.S. claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy.
Against the Soviet Union.
Right, but its actions often contradicted those very ideals.
So it's about acknowledging those inconsistencies.
And digging deeper.
And that's what I find so compelling about Chomsky.
Me too.
He's not afraid to challenge those narratives.
Even if they make people uncomfortable.
And he gives so many examples.
Yeah, like the U.S. supporting brutal dictatorships, suppressing democratic movements, and intervening militarily in countries that posed no real threat.
It's hard to confront.
It is.
But it's an important truth.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that the world isn't black and white.
Even powerful nations
Yeah.
can act in ways that contradict their stated values.
Chomsky argues that this pattern didn't end with the Cold War.
Oh, really?
He says the U.S. continued to intervene around the world.
Give me some examples.
He points to Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan.
It's like this continued pursuit of power.
Exactly. And he's not saying all U.S. foreign policy is bad.
Okay.
But he's urging us to be critical.
To look beyond the surface.
To consider the complexities and recognize the multiple perspectives at play.
So how do these examples sit with you, the listener?
Do you see a disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality?
It's a really important question to ask.
It is.
And it leads to another key theme in Chomsky's work.
Okay, what's that?
His analysis of the role of the media.
The media?
Yeah, in shaping public opinion.
That's especially relevant today.
I mean, we're bombarded with information from everywhere.
It can be hard to know what to believe.
Exactly. And Chomsky argues that the mainstream media, despite its claims of objectivity, often plays a key role in promoting the interests of the powerful.
He says it's not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy,
Okay.
but more of a subtle influence.
Based on the structure and incentives of the media landscape.
Exactly. He identifies 5 filters that he believes shape the news.
Oh, yeah, the 5 filters. Can you remind us what they are?
Sure. So first you have ownership.
Okay, so who owns the media?
Right. And the fact that it's largely earned by big corporations.
Which have their own interests to protect.
Exactly. Then there's advertising.
Right, because media relies on that revenue.
So they're beholden to their advertisers.
You're not going to see stories that alienate the big sponsors.
Exactly. Then there's sourcing.
Okay, where does the information come from?
Right, and the media relies heavily on official sources.
Like government officials.
Yeah, or corporate spokespeople.
But those sources have their own agendas.
Right, they have their own spin on things.
And the information isn't always accurate.
Exactly. So you end up with a very specific narrative.
And that narrative might not reflect the whole picture.
Right.
Okay, what's next?
Next, you have flack.
Flack.
Which refers to the criticism and pressure that media outlets face. Powerful groups.
Oh, I see.
This can be lawsuits, boycotts, even smear campaigns.
So it's like a form of censorship.
It is a form of censorship.
And last but not least,
we have fear.
Okay, how does fear shape the news?
Well, the media often promotes fear and anxiety.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that.
Think about all the stories about crime and terrorism.
And natural disasters.
Right, it's a constant bombardment of fear.
And that makes the public more willing
to
accept policies that restrict their freedoms.
Even if those policies are harmful.
So fear becomes a tool for control.
Exactly.
Like if people are afraid, they'll give up their rights for a sense of security.
That's right.
So these 5 filters work together.
They do.
To create a media system that serves the powerful.
Exactly. And Chomsky's point isn't to make us despair.
Okay.
It's to make us more critical consumers of information.
More discerning about what we consume.
Right. And to seek out alternative sources of information.
It's about becoming more media literate.
Exactly.
So we're not just passive recipients.
Right. We're active participants.
In the process of information gathering.
That's the key.
Okay, well, this leads us to another point he makes.
Okay.
What he calls the new imperial age.
The period after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, when everyone thought it would be the end of history.
Right. A new era of peace and cooperation.
But Chomsky says it wasn't.
No.
He sees it as the emergence of a new form of imperialism.
More subtle.
More insidious.
Exactly. Like imperialism went undercover.
It's like they traded in their military boots for boardrooms.
That's a great way to put it. He says this new imperialism is characterized by these global institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO.
But those institutions are supposed to be good.
I know, right?
Promoting economic development.
Yeah, global cooperation.
So what's the problem?
Chomsky argues that these institutions ultimately serve the interests of wealthy countries.
And corporations.
Yeah, often at the expense of developing countries.
Okay, so how does that play out?
Well, take free trade agreements.
Okay.
They're supposed to boost economic growth for everyone.
Right.
But Chomsky says they often allow corporations to exploit
Exploit what?
Cheap labor and resources in developing countries.
While protecting the interests of the wealthy.
Exactly. It's like an uneven playing field.
Yeah, where the rules are rigged.
Right.
And what about those austerity measures?
Those are another example.
Right.
The IMF and World Bank often impose them on developing countries.
Okay.
They force them to cut social spending.
And privatize public services.
Right. All in the name of fiscal responsibility.
But it leads to
increased poverty.
And suffering.
Exactly. It's like forcing these countries to tighten their belts.
While the global elite are feasting.
That's a great analogy.
So this new imperialism is just as destructive.
It is.
But less visible.
It's a system that maintains global inequality.
Yeah.
And perpetuates exploitation.
So what's the solution?
Well, Chomsky believes we need to start by raising awareness.
Okay.
We need to challenge those dominant narratives about globalization.
And demand better policies.
Exactly. It's a long-term struggle.
Yeah, but an important one.
Absolutely.
So, listener, what do you make of this new imperial age?
Have you noticed its effects?
It's a question worth reflecting on.
It is.
And it brings us to another one of Chomsky's critiques.
Okay.
That feels really relevant today.
Which is?
His take on free markets.
Oh, free market.
Yeah, they've been central to economic policy for decades.
Right.
But Chomsky says they're a myth.
He says markets are never truly free.
Okay.
They're always shaped by power.
So the invisible hand of the market is actually wearing a power glove.
That's a great way to put it.
So the powerful are always rigging the system.
Always. Creating rules and regulations that benefit them.
At the expense of others.
Exactly.
And Chomsky doesn't just say this.
No.
He gives examples.
Yeah, lots of examples.
Like how the U.S. government intervenes in markets.
To protect its own corporations.
With things like subsidies and bailouts.
And trade barriers.
It's like socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor.
Exactly. Chomsky calls it corporate welfare.
Where the rich get richer.
And the poor get poorer.
So if free markets are a myth,
yeah,
what's the alternative?
Well, Chomsky believes we need to move beyond that myth and create a more equitable system.
One that prioritizes human needs.
Exactly. Not corporate profits.
That sounds pretty radical.
It does go against the dominant ideology.
It's like putting people before profits.
Right. Which Chomsky argues is the only way to create a truly just and sustainable society.
So, listener, what are your thoughts?
Do you believe in the free market?
Or do you see it as a rigged system?
It's a question we all need to grapple with.
Especially as inequality keeps rising.
It's a crucial issue.
And it leads to another one of Chomsky's critiques.
Okay.
His analysis of how human rights is used
to justify actions around the world.
It's like human rights have become a buzzword.
Yeah, a marketing tool for foreign policy.
But Chomsky exposes the hypocrisy.
He says the U.S. often invokes human rights when it's convenient.
Okay.
But ignores or violates them when it suits them.
So it's selectively applied.
Right, depending on who's on the receiving end.
He gives a lot of examples.
He does, like supporting brutal dictatorships, engaging in torture, carrying out military interventions with massive civilian casualties.
All while claiming to be a champion of human rights.
Exactly.
So it's a disconnect between words and actions.
Right, like talking a big game but not following through.
And he says these actions are often justified.
Yeah.
By saying it promotes human rights in the long run.
But those claims often ring hollow.
It's like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Yeah, exactly.
For questionable actions.
Chomsky says this hypocrisy undermines U.S. credibility.
And makes it harder to create a more just world.
It erodes trust.
So, as a listener,
have
you noticed this disconnect?
Between the rhetoric and the reality.
It's something to think about.
It is.
Especially as human rights are under threat around the world.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
Well, Chomsky offers a really insightful analysis of Cuba.
Ah, Cuba.
It's been this thorn in the side of U.S. foreign policy for decades.
Chomsky argues that's because Cuba presents this unique challenge to U.S. power.
How so?
Well, despite its size...
Yeah, Cuba's a small country.
And its limited resources.
Right.
It's maintained its independence from the U.S.
For how long?
For over 6 decades.
Wow, that's incredible.
Defying economic warfare,
right,
covert operations, military threats.
That's like a David and Goliath story.
It is, but with much higher stakes.
So Chomsky says this defiance of U.S. power is what motivates the U.S. hostility toward Cuba.
Exactly. The U.S. can't tolerate a country in its own backyard.
Right, that refuses to follow its lead.
It's about control, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Like the U.S. wants to be the dominant force
in the Western Hemisphere.
and Cuba's challenge to that dominance is unacceptable.
It is.
And Chomsky also points to the hypocrisy of the U.S. claiming its opposition is about democracy.
In human rights.
Like we were just talking about.
The selective application of human rights.
Yeah, exactly. He says the U.S. has supported brutal dictatorships.
While condemning Cuba.
For its alleged human rights abuses.
Right, which exposes a double standard.
So it's not about freedom and democracy.
No, it's about power and control.
So how does this Cuba case fit into Chomsky's bigger picture?
It's a perfect example of how he challenges the narrative.
Yeah.
He forces us to look beyond the surface.
To see things from a different angle.
Exactly.
It also shows that even small countries can resist.
Yes, they can.
But that resistance comes at a cost.
It does.
It makes you wonder what the world would look like.
I know, right? If more countries were willing to stand up like Cuba.
It's a really thought-provoking question.
It is, and it leads us to another key aspect of Chomsky's work.
Which is?
His analysis of how history is manipulated.
To serve the interests of the power of
Once history becomes a tool for propaganda.
Exactly. Shaping our perceptions of the present.
Influencing our decisions about the future.
It's a subtle but powerful form of control.
Makes you wonder how much of what we know is just a carefully constructed narrative.
To serve those in power.
So Chomsky urges us to be aware of these manipulations.
To be critical.
To seek out alternative perspectives.
Right, and to think for ourselves about the meaning of the past.
It's about taking ownership of history.
Yeah.
Recognizing it's not just facts and dates.
It's a living story that we all have a role in shaping.
He says a more accurate understanding of history is essential for creating a more just world.
And I agree.
But he doesn't just talk about it generally.
No.
He gives specific examples of distortions.
Like how the U.S. ignores its history of colonialism
and imperialism
to maintain its image as a beacon of freedom and democracy.
It's like peeling back those layers to reveal the uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. And it's not about dwelling on the past.
Okay.
It's about using history to understand the present.
And to inform our decisions about the future.
It's about learning and growth.
So have you ever felt like you've been fed a distorted version of history?
It's something to reflect on.
Absolutely. And it leads us to one of Chomsky's most powerful examples.
Okay.
His analysis of the MIA issue.
In Vietnam.
And how it perpetuates this narrative of American victimhood.
It's a sensitive topic.
It is, but Chomsky approaches it with clarity.
He argues that the focus on American MIAs,
well, understandable on a human level, serves a political agenda.
It allows the U.S. to avoid responsibility.
For the destruction it caused.
Exactly. And to maintain that image as a force for good.
And he highlights the disparity between the attention given to American MIAs and the silence about the Vietnamese victims.
It's a striking example of selective attention.
Right, and this selective focus serves a very specific purpose.
It allows the U.S. to avoid accountability.
To rewrite the narrative.
And to shift the blame.
And he makes this comparison between the demand for remorse from Japan for Pearl Harbor and the lack of remorse demanded from the U.S. for Vietnam.
It's a perfect illustration of a double standard.
Like power influences who gets to be the victim.
Absolutely.
And who gets to be the perpetrator.
It makes you question the narratives we're given.
And who benefits from those narratives.
Exactly. Chomsky says this manipulation isn't limited to Vietnam.
Oh, really?
It's a pattern throughout history.
Especially when justifying war and violence.
It's like those in power get to write the history books.
And they write themselves in as the heroes.
That's right. That's why we need to be critical of the stories we're told.
To seek out alternative perspectives.
And to recognize that history is constructed and reconstructed.
To serve those in power.
Exactly.
So, listener, have you ever noticed how historical narratives are shaped?
What can we do to challenge those narratives?
It's something to think about.
It is.
It leads us to another aspect of Chomsky's critique.
What's that?
His analysis of the U.S. relationship with Israel.
That's a complex topic.
It is. Any discussion of Israel and Palestine is a minefield.
But Chomsky doesn't shy away from it.
No, he doesn't.
He argues that the U.S.'s unconditional support for Israel has been a major obstacle to peace.
In the Middle East?
Right. He points out that the U.S. provides Israel with military aid.
and economic aid,
while also vetoing UN resolutions
that criticize Israel.
for human rights violations.
It's like the U.S. is playing favorites.
It is, turning a blind eye to actions they'd condemn in other countries.
So if the U.S. is such a close ally, why does Chomsky criticize this relationship?
He believes the U.S. needs to be more balanced.
Okay.
He's not saying the U.S. should abandon Israel, but they should use their influence to push for peace.
A just and lasting peace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One that recognizes the aspirations of both sides.
So it's not about taking sides.
No.
It's about finding a solution that benefits everyone.
Exactly. Chomsky says the current status quo is unsustainable.
Where Israel continues to occupy Palestinian territory.
Right, and expands its settlements.
It's creating resentment.
And fueling the cycle of violence.
It's like a wound that's never allowed to heal.
That's a powerful image.
So Chomsky believes the U.S., as the most powerful country, has a responsibility to promote peace.
In the Middle East.
But he says they failed to live up to that responsibility.
By siding with Israel at the expense of the Palestinians.
And that failure has had consequences.
Devastating consequences.
Not just for Israelis and Palestinians.
It's destabilized the entire region.
So, listener, where do you stand on this issue?
It's a complex issue.
With no easy answers.
But it deserves careful consideration.
Absolutely. And it leads us to one of Chomsky's most important concepts.
Okay.
His theory of manufacturing consent.
The idea that the media shapes public opinion.
To manufacture consent for government policies.
It's a theory he developed with Edward S. Herman.
And it helps explain how governments maintain control.
Even in democratic societies.
Like a subtle form of mind control.
Exactly. They achieve this through the 5 filters.
The 5 filters of the media.
Right. Ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack, and fear.
They all work together.
To create a media system.
That serves the powerful.
Exactly. And it's not that journalists are malicious.
Okay.
They're operating within a system with built-in biases.
They're reliant on official sources.
And subject to pressure.
So it's not a conspiracy.
No, it's about how the system is structured.
Chomsky and Herman say this system impacts public opinion.
It makes it harder for people to understand the world.
To challenge the status quo.
Exactly. It's like we're all living in an echo chamber.
The information reinforces the dominant narrative.
That's why manufacturing consent is so important.
It raises awareness.
About the role of the media.
It encourages us to be more critical.
Of the information we consume.
So think about the news you consume.
Where do you get your information?
Who owns those sources?
Who funds them?
What biases might they have?
It's a question worth asking.
It is, and it leads us to another part of Chomsky's critique.
Okay.
His analysis of the U.S. use of military force.
It seems like the U.S. is constantly involved in military conflicts.
Yeah, is it a coincidence or something more?
Chomsky says the U.S. has a long history of using military force.
To achieve its goals.
Often in violation of international law.
And he has examples.
He does, like the Vietnam War and the Iraq War.
Which resulted in
massive civilian casualties.
And widespread destruction.
Exactly.
So what motivates these interventions?
Is it really about spreading democracy?
As we're often told.
Chomsky argues the motives are more complex.
More cynical.
He believes the U.S. often uses flimsy pretexts.
Or even lies.
Yeah, to justify these interventions.
So it's about power and self-interest.
Not about humanitarian concerns.
Chomsky says the U.S. uses military force
to maintain its dominance.
And to protect its economic interests.
Exactly. It's like a bully on the playground.
Using its strength to intimidate others.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
But Chomsky says it's a sign of weakness.
Not strength.
What do you mean?
He says it reflects an inability to achieve goals through diplomacy.
Like they lack the patience.
And the skill.
To build relationships.
Right.
So it's a shortcut.
A quick fix.
That does more harm than good.
Exactly. And Chomsky says this reliance on force undermines U.S. credibility.
And their ability to promote peace.
Exactly.
So listener, is the U.S. too quick to use force?
What are the implications for the world?
These are important questions.
They are.
And they lead us to a very controversial argument.
Okay.
Chomsky's critique of the U.S. role in the Rwandan genocide.
That's a dark chapter in history.
It is.
But Chomsky exposes U.S. complicity.
In the genocide.
Yes. He argues that the U.S. failed to intervene.
In 1994.
To stop the genocide.
But how could the U.S. just stand by?
Chomsky says this inaction was deliberate.
Deliberate.
He says the U.S. had plenty of warning.
But they chose to do nothing.
Exactly.
That's horrifying.
It is.
But why?
Chomsky believes it reflects U.S. indifference to suffering.
The suffering of those not aligned with its interests.
Right. He says the U.S. only acts when it perceives a threat.
Or an opportunity to advance its own agenda.
Exactly.
It's a bleak assessment.
It is.
But it's hard to argue with the historical record.
I agree.
And Chomsky critiques the U.S. role in the aftermath, too.
Saying they did little to help Rwanda rebuild.
So, listener, does the U.S. have a moral obligation to intervene?
How can we hold our government accountable?
It's a complex question.
It is.
With no easy answers.
Right.
And it brings us to another core element of Chomsky's work.
Okay.
His critique of capitalism.
Oh, yeah. He's very critical of capitalism.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme.
Chomsky says capitalism is inherently exploitative.
Based on the pursuit of profit.
At the expense of human well-being.
But isn't capitalism the engine of progress?
Yeah, that's the usual argument. But Chomsky points to the inequalities under capitalism.
Right. The vast inequalities of wealth and income.
Both within and between countries.
So he's saying this concentration of wealth isn't an accident.
It's built into the structure of capitalism.
Like those at the top stay there.
And those at the bottom struggle.
So the system's rigged.
That's essentially Chomsky's argument.
Okay, but he also critiques the impact on the environment.
Oh, absolutely. He's been sounding the alarm on climate change for decades. Yeah. He says capitalism's pursuit of endless growth is at odds with environmental sustainability.
It's like we need more.
Either faster.
And the planet can't keep up.
We're on a treadmill that's speeding up.
And we can't get off.
Exactly.
So what's the solution?
Chomsky doesn't offer a blueprint.
Okay.
But he advocates for a more just and sustainable system.
One that prioritizes human needs.
Over corporate profits.
And ecological balance over endless growth.
Right.
It sounds like a major shift in values.
It is a shift away from that individualistic, consumerist ethos.
The collectivist approach.
Recognizing our interconnectedness.
Our responsibility to each other.
And to the planet.
It's a big challenge.
It is.
Like trying to turn a giant ship around.
It takes time and effort.
And a lot of people pulling in the same direction.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another interesting point Chomsky makes about the role of intellectuals in society.
So he doesn't see them as just academics.
Detached from the real world, no.
They have a duty to engage.
He says they have a responsibility to speak truth to power.
To challenge the status quo.
To use their knowledge for the common good.
So it's not just about being smart.
It's about using your intelligence for good.
Chomsky sees intellectuals as having a moral obligation.
To expose injustice.
To challenge narratives.
To inspire others.
To work for a better world.
It's intellectualism as activism.
That's inspiring.
It is. Chomsky's own work is a testament to that belief.
Challenging conventional wisdom.
Exposing injustice.
Calling for a better world.
Speaking truth to power.
He's a role model.
He is.
But you don't have to be Chomsky to make a difference.
We all have a role to play.
Speaking out against injustice.
Supporting organizations working for change.
Even just having conversations with friends and family.
About these issues.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into year 501.
Yeah.
We want to leave you with this question.
Okay.
What role do you want to play in creating a more just world?
It's a question worth pondering.
Because as Chomsky shows us, the world isn't fixed.
It's constantly being shaped.
By our choices, stories we tell.
We hope this deep dive has given you some new tools.
To understand the world.
And to challenge those systems of power.
Chomsky's work is challenging.
Even unsettling.
But it's also empowering.
It reminds us that we're not powerless.
We have the power to think critically.
To question authority.
To work together.
For a better world.
So, keep questioning, keep learning, keep fighting.
That's the legacy Chomsky has given us.
A legacy worth carrying forward.